Today, we become legends.
A ranged assassin is something I've been asking for in Smite for a long time, and while Tsukuyomi isn't a truly ranged assassin, he's probably the closest we're ever going to get. With him only being released for a few days as of writing this video, these are of course just initial thoughts on what I've seen and experienced in the first few days of his launch, and things can change. But for now, I'm going to break down Tsukuyomi's release into the good, the bad, and the things I would change, so let's jump in. Starting with the good. The whole premise of his design is a winner in my opinion. An assassin focused on range can be hard to pull off since range is typically a weakness of most assassins, not a strength. You need to tone down other aspects of an assassin playstyle such as mobility or burst damage for this to work effectively. If you have high mobility, good range, and burst damage in the same kit, it's a recipe for an OP release. However, I think from an overall design perspective, Tsukuyomi is done very well, which is why it's in the positive section. The way that ranged basic attacks are implemented into his kit is very interesting. Instead of just straight up giving him ranged basic attacks or even extended melee basics similar to a Willix or Achilles, they went with a more restrained approach, only allowing him ranged basics as a one-time use after casting an ability. So there's a very hard limit on how often you can use these, which is a positive thing in my opinion. I do have some changes I would make and negative things to say about the whole ranged basic attack thing, but we'll save those for later. I think the overall mechanic is done very well. Balance concerns completely aside, I also think his 1 and 2 are very cool abilities, especially the 2. I'm a sucker for multi-part abilities like this where you can target switch mid-cast. It makes both a more interesting wave and camp clear, as well as being able to catch enemies off guard in fights when you use the AoE hits on one enemy and then 180 and stun a completely different enemy. And finally we have Tsukuyomi's ultimate, which in my opinion is the coolest part of his kit. This is his main form of mobility, which in itself is a positive to his design. As I said earlier, to give an assassin range and poke, you need to hit other aspects of a typical assassin design, and mobility was the stat they took the most from in order to give him range. Having no mobility in his base kit means it's difficult to hard engage without the use of blink, which you obviously do get on him, no question, but blink has a far longer cooldown than your typical dash or jump. However, you can also use Tsukuyomi's ultimate to engage from a pretty decent range. It's slow to go off because you have to fire the 4 beams before you teleport to your target, but once again, I don't think it should be instant because he needs to suffer a mobility penalty as a trade-off for the ranged poke that he has access to. I love the idea of teleporting in the order you hit enemies since it adds some depth and raises the skill ceiling of the god in teamfights. If you're trying to engage on the enemy backline with this ult, you want to make sure your final beam shot hits the enemy mage or hunter you're looking to dive to, but you're free to use the other shots however you like. In fact, it's better to use them on many enemies as it adds to the chaos that this ultimate brings. I can't imagine what comms will sound like once this guy is allowed in competitive because it's pretty hard to discern exactly where Tsukuyomi will land at the end of his ultimate in the chaos of a teamfight. I also like that they added a clause that allows you to beads this ultimate and he won't dash to you. It's a small detail and usually you don't want to waste your beads on such a small thing, but if you're low and you know he's going to dash to you to finish you off, you can beads to make sure you escape, since he's unlikely to catch you after using his ult because of his lack of mobility in his base kit. But let's move on to the bad of this release. There are some design complaints I have and things I would change, but a lot of this section is focused on balance. I've seen people saying all kinds of things about the balance of Tsukuyomi at release. Some have said he's balanced, some have said he's garbage, and most have said he's pretty OP. I'm definitely in the OP camp here. However, I don't think it's a fundamental design flaw with his kit, like for example Persephone is in my opinion. I think with some balance changes he can be perfectly fine, and the main issue I have with him are his damage numbers. The 2 is the ability that really stood out to me after playing him a few times. I've heard people argue that you should level the 1, then the 3, then the 2, and I'm just blown away by that. The 2 does 560 base damage and 180% scaling, on top of giving speed, knock-up immunity, a 2.5 second disarm, and a 1.4 second stun. And this isn't one of those abilities where it has insane theoretical base damage and potential, but you never really land all the hits. It's very easy to hit all 3 times with this, and even if you don't, you'll likely just miss one of the circular strikes or something, and it still does 425 base and 130% scaling if that happens. Yeah, you can miss one of the hits of this ability, and it still does more damage than basically every assassin ability in the game, excluding ults of course. Speaking of ults, Tsukuyomi's does 1330 base damage with 300% scaling. This one I will give a little bit of slack as it's definitely possible to miss 1 or maybe even 2 of the beams with this, but realistically, unless someone uses a dash or a jump, you should be able to confirm 3 if not 4 hits of this ultimate every time. However, this also hits from 90 units away, which is nearly as far as Thoth's ultimate, and these hits have no travel time unlike Final Judgment, they're basically instant. And of course, this does way more damage than that if you land the 4 hits. The caltrops are also pretty offensive in terms of damage, though I think over time people will learn to save their jump instead of running through these and taking half their health, so this is only a minor issue compared to the 2 and the ultimate in my opinion. Moving on to a few actual design complaints I have. Firstly, the camera issues with the ultimate are very disorienting. I'm not exactly sure how to fix this, but as it is right now, it hurts my eyes when I ult 3 or 4 people in a team fight and have no idea where I even am at the end of it. Maybe this will become less of an issue as I learn the god more and become used to it, but I'd love to see something to make the camera more stable and bearable. They did something similar with the target of King Arthur's 4B and eventually fixed that, so I'm sure they can fix it here too. I also think his passive is a little boring. This is a very minor complaint since most passives in Smite are pretty uninspired and the rest of his kit has a lot of depth to it. But it's me, and whenever I see a passive that's just stats or is something that you never have to think about in game, I'll complain about it, so there you go. Alright, moving on, let's finish up this section with a few things I would change to improve Tsukuyomi at this stage of his release. So as I already mentioned, fix the camera perspective on his ultimate. In my opinion, the ranged auto attack you get from the 1 looks like it should go through minions and damage them all. This might make him too broken however, and if that's the case then just change the targeter to better display that this is a single target because right now it looks like it's AoE. On the topic of ranged autos, I'd like to see his passive worked into them. For me it's a no-brainer and I'm not sure why this isn't already the case. Just make it so if you have the empowered version of your weapon ready and you use a ranged basic attack, it procs the extra effect on it as if it were a normal basic. I don't think it will be too broken for the ranged basic on the 1 to cleave, or the 1 on the 3 to do a bit of bonus damage and heal. Maybe having sustain from range will make him too good as a solo laner, I don't know really, I'm just trying to think of a reason why this doesn't work this way already. Definitely something they should add in my opinion, as it's pretty intuitive and when I first played him I just assumed it would work that way since the ranged basics are classed as basic attacks for all other purposes, yet they're not considered basic attacks for the passive, it makes no sense. And finally for design changes, I don't think the heal from the passive should work on towers, phoenixes, totem and the like. Other similar heal effects like the old berserker shield used to proc on towers, but it was changed to not work that way. That's an item and this is a god, but I still feel like being able to heal from towers using this just feels wrong and probably shouldn't be the case. And finally of course, you need to drastically nerf the damage on the 2 and the ult, and possibly a small nerf to the damage on caltrops as well, though like I said, I think as people learn to play against him better, they won't just walk through the caltrops and take tons of damage. I'm not a balance expert, so proposing specific nerfs isn't my strong suit, but 560 base damage and 180% scaling is the damage of most assassin ultimates, and Tsukuyomi has it on his 2. And his actual ultimate does way over 1000 base and 300% scaling, which adds up to probably another 700 to 800 damage at full build. For the 2, I would nerf the swing damage down to maybe 100 and the final damage down to 250 or maybe even lower, plus half the scaling on the swings and take the final damage scaling down to 50%. With these nerfs it would do 450 base and 100% scaling, which is still very strong, but it's more on the level of something like Susanoo's 1 in terms of damage, but this also comes with CC. On that note, I'd probably take the disarm down to 1 up to 2 seconds instead of 1.5 up to 2.5, and probably make the stun 1 second flat at all ranks instead of 1 up to 1.4. These nerfs might be a bit heavy-handed, but this ability is the worst offender in his kit in my opinion, and is deserving of nerfs in basically every area. For the ult, I'd nerf the base damage mostly. Probably take the beam damage down to 90 and the dash damage down to 150, plus take the scaling on the dashes down from 55 to 30%. This will put the total damage at 960 plus 200% scaling, which is still very high, but this is over a long period of time and it's possible to avoid, both by using jumps or dashes to dodge the initial beams, and also potentially using beads to dodge the dashes. So you don't want to nerf it too heavily or it loses all of its value. I would go with something like these nerfs while also giving him a quote buff by making the passive work on his ranged basics like I mentioned before, and see where he's at that point, adjusting him further if necessary. Something I'm also looking at for a nerf is the 1's cooldown. It's not an incredibly strong ability, so it's probably okay, but 10 seconds or 6 seconds if you pick up the shuriken is a bit much. With full CDR it goes down to 6 seconds base or 2 seconds if you pick up the shuriken, which is really dumb. I would either increase the cooldown at base to something more like 12 or 14 seconds, or I would make the shuriken cooldown reduction into a percent value like 30 or 40% instead of the cooldown reduction flat value like it is now. Doing so means that building full cooldown won't allow for a 2-second cooldown ability. Instead, it will be for example 40% of 6 seconds, which is 2.4 seconds off, leaving it with a 3.6 second cooldown. Still very low, but a lot more than 2 seconds, and the 40% reduction is still 4 seconds if you have no CDR. But that's pretty much it for my initial thoughts on Tsukuyomi and some changes I would make to him both on the design and the balance aspects of his release. Obviously, this is all subject to change with him being a new release, but this is just based off my first few games with him, and of course playing with and against a Tsukuyomi in every single game of casuals I've played since the patch. Leave your thoughts down below on him and what you think should be changed or nerfed to make him more fun and balanced, and I'll catch you guys later. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.